Sometimes the loudest mistake a man can make is assuming he knows who holds the power in the room. The neon sign of Maple Street Diner buzzed softly against the cool evening air, casting red and blue reflections across the chrome trim of parked cars along the curb. Inside, the diner carried the familiar rhythm of a small American town winding down for the night. The quiet clink of coffee mugs, the low hum of a jukebox playing an old country song, the smell of grilled burgers and fresh fries drifting through the warm air. At a corner booth near the window sat two men who looked like any other late-night customers. Marcus Reed, tall and calm with a steady presence that seemed almost effortless, leaned slightly back against the red vinyl seat, his dark jacket folded neatly beside him. Across from him sat Darius Walker, younger, broad-shouldered, his eyes quietly scanning the room with the casual alertness of someone used to noticing things others missed. Between them sat two plates, half-finished meals, and a pair of coffee cups that had long since cooled. To anyone passing by, they were just two men having dinner after a long day. Nothing about them seemed unusual. Nothing about them seemed important. And that was exactly the point. The diner itself was small, maybe 20 stools at the counter and 6 booths along the windows, the kind of place where regulars knew the waitress by name and truckers stopped in for black coffee before getting back on the highway. Nancy Carter, the manager, stood behind the register flipping through receipts while occasionally glancing toward the door. Every few seconds the bell above the entrance would rattle slightly from the wind outside, but the door itself stayed closed. The room carried a comfortable quiet, the kind that made people relax without realizing it. Marcus lifted his coffee mug, took a slow sip, then set it back down with careful precision. His eyes moved briefly toward the clock above the kitchen window. 8:47 p.m. Darius noticed the glance. "You still thinking the same thing?" he asked quietly without looking up from his plate. Marcus didn't answer immediately. Instead, he picked up his fork again, cut a small piece of steak, and took his time chewing. Around them, a family near the counter laughed softly at something a little kid said. A man in a work jacket read the local newspaper beneath the soft glow of a hanging lamp. Everything felt normal, peaceful even. But Marcus had learned long ago that moments like this often sat right on the edge of something else. Finally, he nodded once. "Yeah," he said calmly. "I think tonight's the night." Darius leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose, as if confirming a suspicion he'd been carrying for hours. He glanced toward the diner door, just as the faint beam of headlights swept across the front windows from the street outside. The reflection rolled slowly across the glass like a silent warning. Neither man spoke for a moment. The jukebox hummed softly. Somewhere in the kitchen, a spatula tapped against a metal grill. Marcus reached for the small stack of napkins, folded one neatly, and set it beside his plate. "Remember," he said under his breath, his tone steady and almost casual, "we wait." Darius gave a small nod. Outside, a car door shut. Heavy footsteps moved across the pavement. Then the bell above the diner door rang sharply as it swung open. A uniformed police officer stepped inside, bringing with him the cool night air and a sudden shift in the atmosphere that no one in the room could quite explain yet. Officer Brad Collins paused just inside the doorway, his eyes scanning the diner slowly, methodically, like someone used to deciding who belonged somewhere and who didn't. His gaze moved across the counter, past the booths, until it landed on Marcus and Darius sitting quietly near the window. And the moment his eyes settled there, something in his expression hardened. Officer Brad Collins stepped fully inside the diner and let the door swing shut behind him, the small bell above it giving one last sharp ring before the room settled again into an uneasy quiet. The cool air that followed him and lingered near the entrance for a moment before fading into the warm smell of coffee and grilled onions. Brad removed his patrol cap slowly, resting it against his hip as his eyes continued to sweep across the room. This was not a quick glance. It was the kind of slow inspection that made people straighten in their seats without knowing why. The man reading the newspaper lowered it slightly. The family at the counter stopped laughing. Even the jukebox seemed quieter now. Officer Collins had a reputation. In this part of town, most people in Maplewood recognized him immediately. Tall, broad-shouldered, and carrying himself with the stiff confidence of someone who believed the badge on his chest gave him final authority over any room he entered. He had worked this district for nearly 12 years, long enough to know every street corner, every late-night diner, and every face that belonged in his version of the neighborhood. At least, the version he believed in. Nancy Carter glanced up from the register when she saw him. Her smile was polite but careful. "Evening, Officer Collins," she said. Her voice carried the tone of someone who had practiced being neutral. Brad gave a brief nod, but did not answer right away. His attention had already returned to the booth by the window. Marcus Reed and Darius Walker had not moved. Marcus sat exactly as before, one hand resting near his coffee mug, the other lightly against the table. His posture was relaxed but balanced, like someone who had spent years learning how to remain calm under pressure. Darius, across from him, leaned back slightly with his arms resting along the booth seat. His eyes flicked toward the officer for only a second before returning to the plate in front of him. To anyone watching, it might have looked like they were simply ignoring the presence of a police officer. But the truth was quieter than that. Marcus noticed the shift in the room immediately. He could feel it in the silence. Conversations that had been flowing moments ago now paused mid-sentence. Silverware tapped against plates more cautiously. Even the kitchen noise softened, as if the diner itself understood that something had changed. Marcus reached for his coffee again and took a slow sip, his eyes drifting toward the window beside their booth. The reflection in the glass showed Officer Collins still standing near the door, still watching them. Marcus set the mug down gently. No sudden movements. No reactions. Exactly as planned. Across from him, Darius quietly slid his fork across the plate and leaned forward slightly. "He noticed us faster than I expected," he said under his breath. Marcus gave the smallest nod. People like him always do. The words were calm, almost conversational. But behind them sat months of preparation. Darius glanced once toward the front counter where Nancy pretended to reorganize receipts that were already stacked perfectly. Then he looked back toward Marcus. "Clock?" he asked softly. Marcus glanced again at the wall above the kitchen window. 8:49 p.m. 2 minutes had passed since the patrol car lights had reflected across the diner windows. 2 minutes since Officer Collins stepped through the door. "Right on schedule," Marcus murmured. Meanwhile, Brad Collins finally began moving. His boots crossed the diner floor with slow, deliberate steps that echoed slightly against the tile. Each step carried the kind of authority that expected people to move aside without question. He stopped briefly at the counter, resting one hand against it as he looked toward Nancy. "Busy tonight?" he asked casually, though his eyes were still pointed toward the booth by the window. Nancy kept her expression steady. "Just the usual crowd," she replied. Brad gave a small hum of acknowledgement, but did not look convinced. His gaze drifted again toward Marcus and Darius. Two men sitting quietly in a corner booth. Calm, comfortable, unbothered by his presence. Something about that bothered him more than anything else. Because in Officer Brad Collins's experience, people who had nothing to hide usually acted nervous around authority. But these two men were not nervous at all. Marcus sensed the shift before Brad even started walking again. The officer pushed away from the counter and began heading toward their booth with slow, confident steps. The room grew even quieter as he approached. Marcus folded the napkin beside his plate once more, careful and precise. Across from him, Darius glanced briefly toward the clock. 1 minute left. Neither man looked up as the officer stopped beside their table. Officer Brad Collins stopped beside the booth and rested one hand lightly on the edge of the table, the polished metal of his badge catching the soft light from the hanging lamp above. From this distance, he could study them more carefully. Two men, both calm, both quiet, both sitting with a level of composure that did not match the tension now hanging over the rest of the diner. Marcus Reed kept his eyes on the napkin he had just folded, adjusting its corners with slow, deliberate movements, as though the presence of the officer beside him carried no importance at all. Across the booth, Darius Walker leaned back slightly, his gaze moving lazily toward the window before drifting toward the officer standing over them. The silence stretched for a moment longer than most people would have tolerated. Officer Collins cleared his throat. "Evening," he said, his voice low but firm, the tone of someone accustomed to being acknowledged immediately. Marcus lifted his eyes just enough to meet the officer's gaze, offering a small nod that was polite but not submissive. "Evening," he replied calmly. Darius gave a similar nod, but did not speak. Around them, the rest of the diner pretended not to watch. The man with the newspaper turned a page that he had not finished reading. The family at the counter stared into their milkshakes with sudden fascination. Nancy Carter wiped the same section of countertop for the third time. Everyone knew the pattern. Everyone knew how these moments usually unfolded. Officer Collins shifted his stance slightly and looked down at the plates in front of the two men. Half-eaten meals. Coffee cups. No signs of trouble. Yet something about the scene bothered him. Perhaps it was the lack of nervousness. Perhaps it was the way Marcus Reed sat with quiet confidence, like someone who did not feel the need to explain himself. Brad Collins tilted his head slightly. "You two from around here?" he asked. The question sounded casual, but the weight behind it was not. Marcus took a small breath before answering, as if considering the question more seriously than it deserved. "Passing through," he said evenly. Darius gave the smallest smile, one that did not quite reach his eyes. Collins studied their faces for a moment. He had spent years reading people during late-night patrols, and something about these two did not fit the pattern he expected. Most people shifted in their seats when questioned. Most people tried to prove they belonged somewhere. These two simply sat there, calm as if the entire situation was unfolding exactly the way they expected. Collins tapped two fingers lightly against the table. "You mind telling me what brings you to Maplewood this late?" Marcus lifted his coffee mug again, taking another slow sip before answering. "Dinner," he said simply. The response was so plain that it almost sounded like a challenge. Darius watched the officer carefully now, his posture relaxed but his attention sharp. The clock above the kitchen ticked quietly. 8:50 p.m. 30 seconds remained. Collins let out a short breath through his nose. "Funny," he said, glancing around the diner before looking back at them. "Place like this usually fills up with regulars. Folks who live around here." Marcus nodded once. "Looks like a good diner." The officer's expression tightened slightly. Something in the calm tone irritated him. He straightened his posture and folded his arms across his chest. "Thing is," he continued, "when unfamiliar faces show up in places like this, I like to make sure everything is on the level." Darius leaned forward just a little, resting his elbows on the table. "Everything seems pretty level to me," he said quietly. The air in the diner grew heavier. The jukebox finished its song and fell silent for a moment before another began. Collins stared at the two men, his jaw tightening, as if deciding how far to push the moment. Then he said the words that made several people in the diner stop breathing for a second. "I am going to ask you both to finish up and move along." Marcus did not react immediately. He simply glanced once more at the clock above the kitchen window. 8:51 p.m. Then he looked back at Officer Collins with the same calm expression he had worn all night. Across the booth, Darius's eyes flicked briefly toward Marcus. The signal had arrived exactly on time. Marcus Reed looked at Officer Brad Collins for a long, quiet moment after the request was made, the kind of silence that carried more weight than raised voices ever could. The diner seemed to shrink around them, as every small sound became suddenly noticeable. The hum of the refrigerator behind the counter. The faint scrape of a fork against ceramic somewhere near the back. Even the ticking clock above the kitchen window sounded louder now. Marcus rested his hands lightly on the edge of the table and leaned back just slightly, studying the officer with the calm patience of someone who had seen moments like this unfold many times before. Across from him, Darius Walker slowly reached for his coffee cup and took a small sip, his movements steady and unhurried, as if nothing unusual had been said at all. Officer Collins waited with his arms crossed, clearly expecting resistance or apology or at least some nervous explanation. Instead, he was met with silence and composure, and that only sharpened the tension. "You heard what I said," Collins added after a few seconds, his voice firmer now. "I am asking you both to move along." Marcus glanced down at the plate in front of him, as though considering the request carefully. Then he looked back up again, his expression calm and thoughtful. "Is there a reason for that?" he asked evenly. The question was simple, but it hung in the air like a challenge wrapped in politeness. Collins shifted his weight slightly. "Just keeping things orderly," he replied. "This place has its regulars." Darius placed his coffee cup back on the table with a soft click and leaned forward slightly. "And we are disturbing the order?" he asked quietly. Collins did not answer right away. His eyes moved between the two men again, trying to read them. Something about their calm confidence unsettled him, though he would not have admitted it even to himself. Most people responded to authority with hesitation. These two men did not. Marcus folded his hands together on the table, his posture relaxed but attentive. "We ordered dinner," he said calmly. "We are eating dinner." That seems orderly enough. A few people in the diner shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The man with the newspaper lowered it completely now, unable to pretend he was not listening. Nancy Carter glanced toward the booth again, worry flickering across her face before she quickly looked away. Officer Collins exhaled slowly through his nose. "Look," he said, lowering his voice slightly as if trying to sound reasonable. "I'm not trying to cause trouble here. But sometimes it is better for everyone if certain situations do not linger." Darius raised one eyebrow slightly. "Situations?" Collins gestured vaguely toward the room. "People notice things. They get uncomfortable." Marcus glanced around the diner briefly. The family at the counter looked down quickly when his eyes passed over them. The man with the newspaper pretended to read again. The jukebox quietly shifted into another song. Marcus returned his attention to the officer. "You mean the situation of two customers finishing their meal?" he asked. Collins's jaw tightened. The calm tone clearly irritated him more than open defiance would have. He leaned forward slightly, resting both hands on the edge of the booth table now. "I am giving you both a simple instruction," he said firmly. "Finish up and head out." The room felt heavier with every passing second. Marcus glanced once more toward the clock above the kitchen window. 8:52 p.m. Exactly 1 minute past the moment he had been waiting for. He tapped one finger lightly against the table, a small deliberate movement that Darius immediately noticed. Across the booth, Darius leaned back again, his eyes briefly meeting Marcus's. No words were needed. The signal had been given. Marcus slowly reached for the napkin beside his plate and wiped his hands carefully, his movements deliberate and controlled. Then he placed the napkin down beside the plate and looked directly at Officer Collins again. His voice remained calm when he finally spoke, but something in his tone had changed slightly. The quiet patience was still there, but beneath it was the unmistakable sound of someone who had allowed a situation to unfold exactly as intended. "Officer Collins," Marcus said evenly, "before we decide to leave, there is something you should probably know." Officer Brad Collins frowned slightly when Marcus spoke his name. The reaction was subtle but unmistakable. His eyes narrowed for a fraction of a second as he straightened his posture beside the booth. "How do you know my name?" he asked, his tone no longer casual. Around them the diner remained quiet, but the silence had changed. It was no longer the awkward stillness of strangers witnessing an uncomfortable moment. Now it carried curiosity, the kind that made people lean just a little closer without realizing it. Marcus Reed did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached slowly toward the inside pocket of his dark jacket that rested neatly beside him on the booth seat. The movement was calm, deliberate, and completely unhurried. Officer Collins's eyes followed the motion instantly. His shoulders tightened slightly, not out of fear but out of instinct. Years of patrol work had trained him to watch hands before anything else. Marcus noticed the reaction and paused for a moment, glancing up with a faint calm expression. "Relax," he said quietly. "It is not what you think." Darius Walker remained silent across the table, his attention moving briefly across the room. The family at the counter had stopped pretending to talk. The man with the newspaper now held it folded on the table, watching openly. Nancy Carter stood behind the register with her hands resting on the counter, her expression tense but attentive. Marcus finally reached inside the jacket and removed a small leather wallet. He placed it gently on the table between himself and Officer Collins, but did not open it yet. The soft sound of the leather touching the surface seemed louder than it should have been. Collins looked down at the wallet and then back at Marcus. "If that is an identification," he said slowly, "you should have shown it earlier." Marcus tilted his head slightly. "You did not ask for identification," he replied calmly. The officer's jaw tightened again. For a moment, it looked as though he might respond immediately, but something about Marcus's steady gaze made him hesitate. Across the booth, Darius leaned forward slightly and rested his forearms on the table. "You said you wanted things orderly," he said quietly. "We agree with that." Collins looked between the two men again, now clearly unsure where the moment was heading. The confidence he had carried into the diner began to shift, though he tried not to show it. Marcus placed one hand gently on the leather wallet, but still did not open it. Instead, he spoke again, his voice steady and measured. "Officer Collins, how long have you worked this district?" The question caught the officer slightly off guard. "That is not your concern," Collins replied quickly. Marcus nodded once, as if expecting that answer. About 12 years, he continued calmly. Maplewood Patrol Sector. Mostly night shifts. Known for being thorough. The officer's eyes sharpened now. You have been asking questions about me, he said. Marcus gave a small, thoughtful shrug. Observing, he corrected. Darius glanced briefly toward the clock again. The seconds moved quietly forward. Everything in the diner seemed to hold its breath. Collins folded his arms again, his voice lower now but edged with suspicion. You still have not explained why you know my name. Marcus looked at the leather wallet for a moment before finally flipping it open with a smooth motion. The small metallic badge inside caught the light from the hanging lamp and reflected it sharply across the polished table surface. For a brief second, the reflection flashed across Officer Collins's uniform badge as well. The contrast was impossible to miss. Marcus turned the wallet slightly, so the badge and identification inside faced the officer clearly. His voice remained calm when he spoke. Detective Marcus Reed, he said evenly. Internal Affairs Division. The words landed quietly, but carried enormous weight. Collins stared at the badge without speaking. For the first time since he had entered the diner, the confidence in his posture visibly faltered. Across the table, Darius reached calmly into his own jacket and removed a similar leather wallet. He placed it beside Marcus's on the table and opened it in the same deliberate way. Another badge glinted under the diner lights. Detective Darius Walker, he said quietly. The room felt completely still now. Even the jukebox seemed to fade into the background as the meaning of the moment settled over the small diner. Marcus closed the wallet slowly but kept it resting on the table. His eyes met Officer Collins's again, calm but firm. And tonight, he added softly, you walked into the middle of an active observation. The words settled over the diner like a sudden shift in gravity. For a moment, no one moved. Officer Brad Collins remained standing beside the booth, his eyes fixed on the two badges resting on the table, as though the polished metal had somehow changed the air in the room. The confidence that had carried him through the door minutes earlier no longer fit the moment the same way. It did not disappear completely, but it hesitated. Marcus Reed watched the reaction carefully, the same calm patience still present in his expression. He had seen this transition before. The exact second when authority realized it might not be the only authority present. Across from him, Detective Darius Walker closed his wallet slowly and slid it back into his jacket pocket, his movements steady and controlled. The silence stretched long enough that the ticking clock above the kitchen window seemed louder than the jukebox humming quietly in the background. Collins finally lifted his eyes from the table and looked directly at Marcus again. His voice was still firm, but the certainty behind it had shifted slightly. Internal Affairs, he repeated slowly, as if testing the words for weight. Marcus gave a small nod. That is correct. Collins straightened his posture again, folding his arms across his chest as he tried to regain the control he had carried into the diner. You expect me to believe that two detectives from Internal Affairs are sitting in a diner at night watching people eat? He asked. His tone carried a hint of skepticism, but it also carried caution now. Marcus leaned back slightly in the booth and rested one arm along the seat behind him, his eyes steady on the officer. Observation does not always look dramatic, he replied calmly. Darius glanced briefly around the diner again. Several customers had stopped pretending not to listen entirely now. The man with the newspaper leaned forward with both elbows on the table. The family at the counter watched quietly. Nancy Carter stood still behind the register, her expression careful but attentive. Marcus noticed the attention but did not acknowledge it. Instead, he continued watching Collins. This diner happens to sit within a patrol route that has generated a number of citizen complaints over the past year, Marcus explained evenly. Collins's jaw tightened slightly. Complaints happen everywhere, he said quickly. Marcus nodded once. Yes, they do. The response carried no argument, no accusation, just quiet agreement. And somehow that made it heavier. Collins shifted his stance again, glancing briefly toward the door as if considering his next move. You still have not explained why you were watching me, he said. Marcus tilted his head slightly. You were not the only reason we were here tonight. Darius spoke for the first time since revealing his badge. But you did make the evening more productive. The words were calm, almost conversational, yet the meaning behind them landed clearly. Collins looked between the two detectives again, trying to read their expressions. What he found there was not hostility, not triumph either, just quiet certainty. Marcus reached for his coffee mug again, though the coffee inside had long since cooled. He lifted it slightly, but did not drink. Instead, he looked at Collins over the rim of the cup. "Officer Collins," he said slowly, "do you remember the last 3 incident reports filed from businesses along Maple Street?" Collins frowned slightly. "I handle dozens of calls a week." Marcus nodded again. "Exactly." Darius leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the table. "The diner owner filed one of those reports," he said calmly. Collins glanced instinctively toward the counter where Nancy Carter now stood perfectly still. She did not look away this time. The officer's eyes narrowed slightly. Marcus lowered the coffee mug back onto the table with a soft sound. "Sometimes patterns take time to become clear," he continued quietly. "Tonight we were simply observing how those patterns unfold in real time." The room felt smaller now, as though every word spoken at the booth echoed off the diner walls. Collins looked again at the 2 detectives, his expression caught somewhere between skepticism and realization. The clock above the kitchen window ticked forward another second, and for the first time since he walked into the diner, Officer Brad Collins understood that the room he thought he controlled had been watching him all along. Officer Brad Collins remained standing beside the booth, but the space he occupied no longer felt like his territory. A few minutes earlier, he had entered the diner with the quiet authority of someone who believed the room would bend to his presence. Now that certainty had shifted. The weight of the conversation had turned the booth by the window into the center of the room, and everyone in Maple Street Diner could feel it. Marcus Reed watched him calmly, the same steady composure still resting in his posture. The detective did not look angry. He did not look triumphant either. He simply looked like a man who had allowed a moment to unfold exactly the way it was supposed to. Across the booth, Darius Walker leaned back slightly, his eyes moving once across the diner before returning to the officer. The customers no longer pretended to ignore what was happening. The man with the newspaper had folded it completely now. The family at the counter sat quietly, their milkshakes untouched. Nancy Carter stood behind the register with both hands resting on the countertop, her eyes fixed on the booth where the entire evening had quietly shifted direction. Officer Collins exhaled slowly and looked around the diner before focusing again on Marcus. "So what exactly are you suggesting?" he asked. His voice was still controlled, but the sharp edge of earlier authority had softened into caution. Marcus reached for the leather wallet again, closing it carefully before placing it back inside his jacket pocket. "I am not suggesting anything," he said evenly. "I am describing what happened tonight." Collins frowned slightly. "What happened tonight," he replied, "is that I asked 2 individuals to move along." Darius gave a small, thoughtful nod, as if acknowledging the statement. "Yes," he said quietly. "You did." Marcus rested his hands lightly on the table again. "You approached 2 men who were eating dinner," he continued calmly. "You asked them to leave without identifying any violation of policy or law." Collins opened his mouth to respond, but Marcus raised one hand gently, not as a command, but as a request for patience. The gesture alone was enough to make the officer pause. "Before you answer," Marcus added softly, "you should understand that this conversation is not being remembered only by the people in this room." Collins's eyes narrowed slightly. "What does that mean?" Marcus glanced briefly toward the corner of the diner's ceiling where a small security camera rested above the entrance. The red indicator light blinked quietly. Then he looked back at Collins. "Nancy has been cooperating with internal affairs for several weeks," Marcus said. The manager behind the counter shifted slightly, but did not look away this time. Collins followed Marcus's glance toward the camera and then back toward Nancy. Something in his expression changed again. Not panic. Not yet. But awareness. Darius leaned forward slightly now, his tone still calm and measured. "Patterns matter," he said quietly. "Citizen complaints. Business reports. Officer interactions. When those patterns repeat, we take a closer look." The clock above the kitchen window ticked forward again. The sound seemed louder than before. Collins folded his arms once more, but this time the gesture looked more defensive than authoritative. "You are building a case over a conversation in a diner?" he said. Marcus shook his head slightly. "No," he replied. "We are documenting behavior." The distinction landed heavily in the quiet room. Collins looked around again, noticing the attention of the customers who now watched openly. For the first time since entering the diner, he seemed aware of the audience that had been present the entire time. Marcus leaned forward slightly, his voice steady but firm. "Officer Collins, the badge you wear represents trust. Every interaction you have in this district either strengthens that trust or weakens it." The words were not loud, but they carried across the room. Darius nodded once. "Tonight you walked into a room and assumed you already knew the outcome," he added quietly. Collins did not answer immediately. His gaze moved from Marcus to Darius, then briefly toward the camera again. The diner felt completely still. Finally Marcus spoke once more, his voice calm but unmistakably clear. "The question now is not what you believed when you walked through that door," he said. "The question is what you will choose to do now that you know who was sitting at this table." Officer Brad Collins stood silent for several seconds after Marcus Reed finished speaking. The question hung in the air like the final note of a song that no one in the room wanted to interrupt. For the first time since entering Maple Street Diner, the officer did not immediately respond. Instead, he glanced slowly around the room again, and what he saw was very different from the moment he had stepped through the door earlier that evening. The customers were not avoiding his gaze anymore. They were watching him, not with hostility, but with curiosity. The man with the newspaper had turned his chair slightly toward the booth. The family at the counter sat quietly, the parents exchanging a brief look before returning their attention to the scene unfolding near the window. Nancy Carter remained behind the register, her hands folded together now, her expression steady but serious. The small camera mounted near the ceiling continued its quiet blinking above the entrance, capturing every movement with patient indifference. Collins inhaled slowly and let the breath out through his nose, as if recalibrating his thoughts. The moment had shifted beyond the simple authority he had expected to exercise when he walked in. Now every word mattered. Marcus Reed watched him carefully but without aggression. His posture remained relaxed, but there was a quiet firmness in the way he held himself that made it clear the conversation had reached an important point. Across the booth, Darius Walker rested one hand on the table while the other remained loosely against the back of the seat. He said nothing. He did not need to. Officer Collins finally spoke. "You are saying this whole thing," he began slowly, gesturing lightly toward the table, the room, and the quiet audience around them, "is part of an investigation." Marcus answered without hesitation. "Observation," he said calmly. Collins nodded once, absorbing the word. Observation meant something very specific in police work. It meant documentation, patterns, reports, and sometimes consequences. The officer shifted his weight slightly, the polished floor reflecting the faint glow of the diner lights beneath his boots. "And what exactly did you observe tonight?" he asked. Marcus leaned forward just slightly, resting his forearms on the table now. His voice remained measured and calm, but the clarity of his words carried across the diner. "We observed an officer entering a public business and asking two customers to leave without identifying a violation of policy or law," he said. Collins opened his mouth to respond, but Marcus continued before the interruption could form. "We observed the tone of the interaction, the assumptions behind it, and the reaction of the people who witnessed it." The words were not accusations. They were statements, factual and precise. Darius nodded once as Marcus finished speaking. "Everything that happened tonight," he added quietly, "will be included in a report." Collins glanced again toward the small ceiling camera. The blinking red light seemed brighter now. For the first time since the conversation began, the officer looked genuinely thoughtful rather than defensive. The room waited. Even the quiet hum of the refrigerator behind the counter seemed to fade into the background as the silence stretched. Marcus did not rush the moment. He had learned long ago that the most important decisions often arrived in quiet spaces like this one. Finally, Collins straightened his posture again and looked directly at Marcus Reed. The tension in his expression had changed. It had not vanished completely, but something else had replaced it. Awareness. "You said earlier that trust matters," he said slowly. Marcus nodded once. Collins looked briefly toward the customers again, then back toward the detectives. When he spoke again, his voice carried less authority and more reflection than before. Maybe tonight did not start the way it should have. The statement was small, almost understated, but it carried through the diner like a turning point. Marcus studied him for a moment before responding. "What matters now," he said calmly, "is what happens after the moment." Collins gave a short nod, as if acknowledging that the evening had reached a place where choices carried more weight than words. The clock above the kitchen window ticked forward again. And for the first time since the officer walked through the diner door, the room no longer felt like a confrontation. It felt like a decision waiting to be made. The quiet inside Maple Street Diner lingered for several long seconds after Officer Brad Collins finished speaking. The moment did not explode into arguments or raised voices. Instead, it settled into something deeper, something heavier. The kind of silence that follows when people realize they have witnessed a moment that will be remembered long after the plates are cleared and the lights are turned off. Marcus Reed watched the officer carefully, studying the shift in his expression. The tension that had filled the room earlier had slowly transformed into reflection, and that change mattered more than anything else that had happened that night. Marcus leaned back slightly in the booth, his hands resting calmly on the table. Across from him, Darius Walker allowed a small breath to escape through his nose, not in frustration, but in quiet acknowledgement that the moment had reached its natural turning point. Officer Collins glanced once more around the diner. The people who had quietly observed the interaction were still watching, but the curiosity in their faces had softened. What they were seeing now was no longer confrontation. It was understanding unfolding in real time. Collins nodded once, slowly. "I suppose tonight has been educational," he said. His voice was steady, but the tone carried a humility that had not been present when he first walked through the door. Marcus gave a small, thoughtful nod. "Most important lessons arrive when we are not expecting them," he replied calmly. Collins looked briefly toward the small security camera above the entrance again, then toward Nancy Carter behind the register. She met his gaze without hesitation this time. There was no anger in her expression, just quiet expectation. The officer exhaled again and adjusted the brim of his patrol cap in his hands before placing it back on his head. When he spoke again, his voice carried the calm weight of someone who understood the moment fully now. "Enjoy your dinner, detectives," he said. The words were simple, but they carried the acknowledgement that the evening had taken a path he had not anticipated. Marcus gave a small nod in return. "Drive safe tonight, Officer Collins," he replied evenly. For a moment Collins remained standing beside the booth, as if considering whether to say anything more. But the lesson of the evening had already been spoken through actions rather than speeches. He gave a final nod to the two detectives, then turned and walked slowly toward the diner door. The room followed him with quiet attention as his boots crossed the tiled floor. When he reached the entrance, he pushed the door open and stepped back into the cool night air. The bell above the door rang once again as it swung closed behind him. Inside the diner, the tension finally dissolved. Conversations slowly returned. The man with the newspaper unfolded it again with a thoughtful expression. The family at the counter resumed their quiet discussion. Nancy Carter released a breath she had been holding and returned to organizing the register drawer. Marcus reached for his coffee mug again, though the coffee inside had gone cold long ago. He lifted it anyway and took a small sip, his expression thoughtful. Darius looked across the table at him with a faint smile. "Not the quiet dinner I expected," he said. Marcus gave a slight shrug. "Patterns rarely reveal themselves during quiet evenings," he replied. Darius nodded, understanding the deeper meaning behind the words. The clock above the kitchen window ticked forward again as the diner returned to its normal rhythm. Outside, the red and blue reflections of passing traffic briefly swept across the glass before fading into the night. Marcus set the coffee mug back onto the table and glanced once more toward the door where Officer Collins had exited only moments earlier. His voice, when he finally spoke again, was calm and reflective. "A badge gives someone authority," he said quietly. Darius looked at him, waiting. Marcus's eyes drifted briefly toward the blinking red light of the security camera near the ceiling before returning to the table. "But respect," he finished softly, "comes from the choices made while wearing it.